Hi guys. The arrival of the disease. The disease came to Europe in a way that was not expected. It moved slowly at first, spreading from one place to another without much notice. People did not understand where it had come from or how it could be stopped. The illness was called smallpox, and it made people sick in a way that was hard to forget. It started with a fever and then a rash that covered the body. The skin became red and painful, and the person could not move easily. Some people died because their bodies could not fight the sickness. Others lived but were left with scars that never went away. Many people thought the disease was punishment from the gods. They prayed for help and tried to find ways to stay safe. Some believed that if they avoided certain places or people, they would not get sick. Others tried to use herbs and mixtures that were said to protect against the illness. But none of these methods worked well. The disease continued to spread through villages and cities, taking more lives each day. There were no doctors who knew how to cure the illness. The knowledge of medicine was limited, and people did not have the tools to understand what was happening. They watched as friends and family fell ill and could do little to stop it. The fear of the disease grew, and people began to avoid others, not knowing who might be carrying it. This made it harder to treat those who were sick and caused more suffering. There were no clear signs that the disease would end soon. It moved quietly through the land, appearing in one town after another, always finding new people to make sick. Some families lost several members in a short time, leaving behind empty homes and quiet streets. Others lost only one or two, but that was still enough to change the way they lived. The people of Europe faced this challenge with uncertainty and fear, not knowing when the sickness would end. They looked around them and saw the effects of the disease everywhere, children crying, adults struggling to walk, and the silence of those who had passed away. The disease changed the way people lived. They built walls around their homes, kept their distance from strangers, and tried to keep their houses clean. But even with these efforts, the illness found a way in. It was a constant presence, always waiting for the next person to fall. The people of Europe faced this challenge with uncertainty and fear, not knowing when the sickness would end. The arrival of the disease marked a difficult time in history. It brought pain and loss, but also lessons that would shape the future. People learned that some things could not be controlled, and that sometimes the best they could do was survive. The struggle against the disease was just beginning, and the road ahead would be long and difficult. The disease came to Europe in a way that was not expected. It moved slowly at first, spreading from one place to another without much notice. People did not understand where it had come from or how it could be stopped. The illness was called smallpox, and it made people sick in a way that was hard to forget. It started with a fever and then a rash that covered the body. The skin became red and painful, and the person could not move easily. Some people died because their bodies could not fight the sickness. Others lived but were left with scars that never went away. Many people thought the disease was punishment from the gods. They prayed for help and tried to find ways to stay safe. Some believed that if they avoided certain places or people, they would not get sick. Others tried to use herbs and mixtures that were said to protect against the illness. But none of these methods worked well. The disease continued to spread through villages and cities, taking more lives each day. There were no doctors who knew how to cure the illness. The knowledge of medicine was limited, and people did not have the tools to understand what was happening. They watched as friends and family fell ill and could do little to stop it. The fear of the disease grew, and people began to avoid others, not knowing who might be carrying it. This made it harder to treat those who were sick and caused more suffering. There were no clear signs that the disease would end soon. It moved quietly through the land, appearing in one town after another, always finding new people to make sick. Some families lost several members in a short time, leaving behind empty homes and quiet streets. Others lost only one or two, but that was still enough to change the way they lived. The people of Europe faced this challenge with uncertainty and fear, not knowing when the sickness would end. They looked around them and saw the effects of the disease everywhere: children crying, adults struggling to walk, and the silence of those who had passed away. The disease changed the way people lived. They built walls around their homes, kept their distance from strangers, and tried to keep their houses clean. But even with these efforts, the illness found a way in. It was a constant presence, always waiting for the next person to fall. The people of Europe faced this challenge with uncertainty and fear, not knowing when the sickness would end. The arrival of the disease marked a difficult time in history. It brought pain and loss, but also lessons that would shape the future. People learned that some things could not be controlled, and that sometimes the best they could do was survive. The struggle against the disease was just beginning, and the road ahead would be long and difficult. The disease came to Europe in a way that was not expected. It moved slowly at first, spreading from one place to another without much notice. People did not understand where it had come from or how it could be stopped. The illness was called smallpox, and it made people sick in a way that was hard to forget. It started with a fever and then a rash that covered the body. The skin became red and painful, and the person could not move easily. Some people died because their bodies could not fight the sickness. Others lived but were left with scars that never went away. Many people thought the disease was punishment from the gods. They prayed for help and tried to find ways to stay safe. Some believed that if they avoided certain places or people, they would not get sick. Others tried to use herbs and mixtures that were said to protect against the illness. But none of these methods worked well. The disease continued to spread through villages and cities, taking more lives each day. There were no doctors who knew how to cure the illness. The knowledge of medicine was limited, and people did not have the tools to understand what was happening. They watched as friends and family fell ill and could do little to stop it. The fear of the disease grew, and people began to avoid others, not knowing who might be carrying it. This made it harder to treat those who were sick and caused more suffering. There were no clear signs that the disease would end soon. It moved quietly through the land, appearing in one town after another, always finding new people to make sick. Some families lost several members in a short time, leaving behind empty homes and quiet streets. Others lost only one or two, but that was still enough to change the way they lived. The people of Europe faced this challenge with uncertainty and fear, not knowing when the sickness would end. They looked around them and saw the effects of the disease everywhere: children crying, adults struggling to walk, and the silence of those who had passed away. The disease changed the way people lived. They built walls around their homes, kept their distance from strangers, and tried to keep their houses clean. But even with these efforts, the illness found a way in. It was a constant presence, always waiting for the next person to fall. The people of Europe faced this challenge with uncertainty and fear, not knowing when the sickness would end. The arrival of the disease marked a difficult time in history. It brought pain and loss, but also lessons that would shape the future. People learned that some things could not be controlled, and that sometimes the best they could do was survive. The struggle against the disease was just beginning, and the road ahead would be long and difficult. Beliefs and superstitions. People in Europe during this time had many ideas about why the disease was happening. Some thought it was a punishment from God, a sign that people had done something wrong and needed to change their ways. Others believed it was caused by bad air or evil spirits that moved through the land. These beliefs were common because there was no scientific way to explain what was happening. People did not know how the illness spread or what made it so deadly. They saw the suffering around them and tried to find reasons for it, even if those reasons were not based on facts or knowledge. In response to these fears, many people turned to religious practices. They prayed for protection and asked for forgiveness for their sins. Some went on pilgrimages to holy places, hoping that their journey would bring them safety. Others kept small icons or charms near their homes, believing they could ward off the sickness. These actions gave people a sense of control, even if they did not stop the disease from spreading. In a time of great uncertainty, having something to do, something to believe in, helped people feel less helpless. There were also many superstitions about how to avoid getting sick. Some people believed that certain foods or drinks could protect them. Others avoided going outside when the wind blew in a particular direction, thinking that the illness traveled with the air. Some thought that if they stayed inside all day, they would be safe. These ideas varied from place to place, but they all came from the same place: fear and a lack of understanding. People wanted to believe that there was something they could do to stay healthy, even if it was just a small gesture. Many people tried to find signs that the disease would end. They watched the sky, looked at the stars, and listened to the animals. If the weather changed or if birds flew in a certain way, some believed it meant the illness was leaving. Others paid attention to the behavior of plants and trees, thinking that nature could give clues about what was happening. These beliefs were not based on facts, but they helped people feel like they were doing something to protect themselves. Even if the illness continued to spread, having something to look for gave people a sense of hope. Despite all these efforts, nothing really stopped the disease. It continued to move through the land, taking more lives each day. People who followed these beliefs often felt confused when the illness still came to them. This led to more fear and more questions about what was happening. Some people began to doubt their own beliefs, wondering if there was something else they could do to stay safe. The more they tried, the more they realized that their methods were not working, which only increased their frustration. The lack of clear answers made it hard for people to know what to believe. Some trusted the church more than ever, while others became skeptical of religious leaders. This created tension between different groups, as people argued over what the disease meant and how to respond. The uncertainty made life even harder for those who were already suffering. In a world where the cause of the illness was unknown, people struggled to find any kind of stability or direction. Even though these beliefs did not prevent the disease, they played an important role in how people coped with the situation. They provided comfort, a sense of purpose, and a way to make sense of something that seemed impossible to understand. People used these ideas to help them deal with the pain and loss around them, even if they did not always work. In times of great hardship, having something to believe in was often more important than having a solution. Over time, some of these beliefs began to fade as more people saw that they did not stop the illness. But for many, the fear remained strong, and the need for answers grew greater. The search for solutions continued, and new ideas began to take shape. The next step in the fight against the disease would come from different sources, but it would take time before people found a real way to stop it. The struggle was far from over, and the people of Europe would have to face many more challenges before they could begin to heal. The spread of the illness. The disease moved through Europe in a way that was difficult to control. It traveled from one village to another, often without warning. People did not know how it spread, so they could not stop it effectively. Some believed it passed through the air, others thought it came from water or food, and some blamed it on animals or strange creatures. Without clear information, people made guesses about what was happening, but none of these guesses led to real solutions. Every time someone got sick, it created more confusion and fear, as no one could say for sure why it was happening or how to prevent it. As the illness spread, more people became sick. Families lost members, and entire communities were affected. Some places had too many sick people to care for them all, so people had to leave their homes and go somewhere else. This movement helped the disease travel even further, as infected individuals carried it to new areas. the sickness did not follow any pattern, making it hard to predict where it would appear next. One day a town might be healthy, and the next day it could be filled with people who were weak and unable to move. This unpredictability made it even harder for people to prepare or protect themselves. In some places, the illness arrived suddenly and caused a lot of death in a short time. In other places, it spread slowly, giving people a little time to prepare. But no matter how fast or slow it came, it always found a way in. People watched as neighbors fell ill, and then they saw those same neighbors die. This created a deep sense of fear, and many people began to avoid each other, not knowing who might be carrying the disease. They stopped visiting each other, kept their distance, and tried to stay away from anyone who looked unwell. These actions were meant to protect them, but they also made life harder in many ways. The spread of the illness changed the way people lived. They stopped visiting each other as much, kept their doors closed, and avoided public gatherings. Children stayed inside more, and adults worked alone rather than in groups. These changes were meant to protect people, but they also made life harder. Without contact with others, people felt lonely and unsure of what to do. The disease was not just taking lives, it was changing the way people connected with one another. Relationships became strained, and trust was lost as people worried about being harmed by those around them. As the illness continued to move, more and more people became afraid. They did not know when it would come again or where it would go next. Some tried to leave their towns, hoping to find safety elsewhere, but this only helped the disease spread further. Travelers carried the illness to new places, and soon, even distant villages were affected. No one was safe, and no one knew how long the sickness would last. The fear was constant, and the uncertainty was overwhelming. People could not plan for the future, because they did not know if they would live to see it. The fear of the illness grew stronger as it spread. People looked around and saw signs of its presence everywhere: empty homes, quiet streets, and the sadness in people's eyes. They heard stories of families that had been completely wiped out, and they worried that the same thing could happen to them. This fear made people act in ways that were not always helpful. Some locked themselves inside, while others tried to hide the sick from others. These actions did not stop the disease, but they did create more suffering. People were afraid of each other, and that fear made everything worse. The illness did not care about who it affected. It took people of all ages, from young children to old men and women. Some families lost multiple members in a short time, leaving behind empty homes and broken hearts. Others lost only one person, but that loss was still enough to change their lives forever. The disease did not discriminate, and it did not stop for anyone. It simply moved forward, spreading wherever it could. It was relentless, and there was no way to escape it once it had taken hold. Even as the illness spread, people tried to find ways to protect themselves. They built walls around their homes, burned things they thought might carry the sickness, and avoided anything that seemed dangerous. But none of these efforts really worked. The disease found a way in no matter what people did. It was like trying to hold back the wind. No matter how hard you pushed, it always found a way through. People tried everything they could think of, but nothing stopped the illness from moving forward. The spread of the illness was a constant reminder of how powerless people felt. They could not stop it, they could not understand it, and they could not escape it. Every day brought new news of more people getting sick, and every night brought the fear of what might happen next. The disease was everywhere, and it was not going away anytime soon. The people of Europe had to face this reality, even though it was difficult to accept. They had to live with the knowledge that no one was safe, and that the sickness would continue until something changed. The lack of medical knowledge at the time when the illness spread across Europe, there was very little understanding about how diseases worked. Doctors did not know what caused sickness or how to treat it effectively. They could not see germs or bacteria, so they had no way to understand why people became ill. Instead, they made guesses based on what they saw and what they believed. Some thought the illness came from bad air, others thought it was caused by an imbalance in the body, and some blamed it on the stars or the weather. These ideas were not based on science, but they were the best explanations people had at the time. Without proper knowledge, people relied on their beliefs and traditions, even when those beliefs did not help them. Medical knowledge was limited, and most people did not have access to doctors. Those who did visit a physician often received treatments that did not help. Some doctors tried to bleed patients, believing that removing blood would make them feel better. Others used herbs and mixtures that were supposed to cure the illness, but these rarely worked. People followed these treatments because they had no other options, even though they knew they were not making things better. The lack of real medical knowledge meant that people had to rely on whatever advice they could get, even if it was wrong. This made it hard for anyone to recover, and many people died without ever knowing what was happening to them. There were no medicines that could stop the disease. No one had discovered vaccines or antibiotics, and no one knew how to fight the illness inside the body. People tried many different things to feel better, but none of them helped. Some took hot baths, thinking that heat would kill the sickness. Others drank strong liquids, hoping they would push out the illness. None of these methods worked, and many people continued to get worse. The lack of effective treatments made it hard for anyone to recover, and many people died without ever knowing what was happening to them. The suffering was constant, and the fear was growing with every passing day. Doctors and healers did not have the tools to study the disease properly. They could not look at the body and see what was wrong, so they had to guess. They watched people as they got sick and tried to find patterns, but they did not have enough information to understand the cause. This made it difficult to develop any kind of plan to stop the illness. Without clear answers, people could not know what to do, and this made the situation even harder to manage. The uncertainty added to the fear, and people felt more helpless than ever. The fear of the illness grew because people did not know how to protect themselves. They saw others getting sick and dying, but they could not find a way to prevent it. Some people tried to avoid going outside, thinking that staying inside would keep them safe. Others tried to stay away from people who looked unwell, hoping they would not catch the sickness. But none of these actions really stopped the illness from spreading. It moved through the land regardless of what people did, and this made them feel even more helpless. The more they tried, the more they realized that their efforts were not working, which only increased their frustration. Many people felt lost and confused. They did not know what was causing the illness or how to stop it. Some turned to religious leaders for guidance, hoping they would have answers. Others tried to find signs in nature, looking for clues that might explain what was happening. But no one had the right answers, and this uncertainty made life even harder. People lived with constant fear, not knowing when the next person would fall ill or when the sickness would end. Every day brought new worries, and every night brought the same heavy silence of loss and sorrow. The lack of medical knowledge also made it difficult for people to care for the sick. Without proper training or tools, those who tried to help often did not know what to do. They could not give the right medicine, they could not clean wounds properly, and they could not stop the pain. This made the suffering worse, and it added to the sense of helplessness that people already felt. The sick were left alone, and their families were forced to watch them die without being able to do anything to save them. The emotional weight of this was unbearable, and many people were left with nothing but grief and unanswered questions. Even among those who tried to help, there was confusion about what to do. Some believed that certain foods or drinks could make the illness go away. Others thought that prayer or ritual could bring healing. But these ideas were not based on facts, and they did not work. People tried everything they could think of, but nothing changed the outcome. The illness continued to take lives, and the people of Europe had to live with the knowledge that they could not stop it. The struggle was long, and the hope was fading with each passing day. The lack of medical knowledge created a cycle of fear and frustration. People did not know how to protect themselves, they did not know how to treat the sick, and they did not know how to end the illness. This made every day a struggle, and it made the future seem uncertain. Without a clear path forward, people had to face the illness with nothing but hope and uncertainty. They could only wait and watch as the disease continued to move through their world, taking more lives each day. The past offered no solutions, and the future held no guarantees. All they could do was endure and try to survive. Social changes and isolation. As the illness continued to spread, people began to change the way they lived. They no longer visited each other as often as before. Families that once gathered together for meals or celebrations now kept their distance. People stopped going to markets, avoided public places, and stayed inside their homes as much as possible. This change was not just about fear, it was a way to try to protect themselves from getting sick. But it also created a sense of loneliness and separation that was hard to deal with. The world had become quieter, and the usual sounds of life were replaced by silence and uncertainty. People missed the comfort of being close to others, but they could not risk being near them. The way people interacted with each other changed in many ways. Friends no longer met in the streets, neighbors did not visit each other's houses, and children played alone instead of with others. The usual routines of daily life were disrupted, and people had to find new ways to live without the comfort of close relationships. Some people found it difficult to adjust, and they felt lost without the support of those around them. The world had become quieter, and the noise of everyday life had been replaced by silence and uncertainty. Without the presence of others, many people struggled to feel connected to the world around them. Isolation became a common way of life. People locked their doors, covered windows, and tried to keep their homes free from outside influences. They did not want to let the illness in, so they made sure that no one entered without being carefully watched. This led to a growing sense of distrust between people. No one knew who might be carrying the sickness, and this fear made it hard to trust anyone. Even those who were healthy were treated with suspicion, and this added to the tension in communities. People who had once been kind and open now hesitated to offer help, afraid that they might bring the illness into their own homes. The changes in social behavior affected more than just how people moved through the world, they also changed how they thought about each other. People who had once been friendly and helpful now hesitated to offer help. They worried that by helping someone else, they might bring the illness into their own home. This made it harder for people to support each other, and it created a sense of isolation that was hard to overcome. Without the support of others, many people struggled to cope with the loss and suffering around them. The emotional weight of the illness was heavy, and the lack of connection made it even harder to bear. The way people dressed and behaved also changed. Some people wore masks or covered their faces when they went outside, thinking that this would protect them from the illness. Others avoided touching anything that had been touched by another person, even if they had no reason to believe it was dangerous. These actions were based on fear, but they also showed how deeply the illness had affected daily life. People were no longer able to move freely, and their actions were guided by the need to stay safe, even if it meant living in constant worry. Every small decision carried the weight of survival, and every moment was filled with the possibility of danger. In some places, entire villages closed their gates and refused to let outsiders in. This was done to prevent the illness from spreading further, but it also made it harder for people to get supplies or help. Those who lived inside these walls had to rely on what they already had, and this created a sense of scarcity and hardship. Some people left their homes to find safety elsewhere, but this only helped the illness move to new areas. The more people moved, the more the disease spread, making it even harder to control. The efforts to protect themselves sometimes made the situation worse, and the cycle of fear and movement continued. The changes in society also affected how people saw themselves. Many people felt guilty for not being able to help others, and they worried that they might be responsible for spreading the illness. This guilt added to the emotional burden that people carried every day. They were not only dealing with the fear of getting sick, but also with the pain of watching others suffer and knowing that they could not do much to stop it. The weight of responsibility and helplessness was heavy, and it shaped the way people viewed their place in the world. Over time, the isolation and changes in behavior became a normal part of life. People adapted to the new way of living, even though it was not easy. They learned to survive without the company of others, and they found ways to cope with the loneliness that came with it. But even as they adjusted, the fear of the illness remained, and it continued to shape the way they lived and thought about the world around them. The struggle was not just against the disease, it was also against the changes it brought to society itself. The world had changed, and there was no going back to the way things used to be. Efforts to prevent infection. People tried many different ways to stop the illness from spreading. They believed that if they kept their homes clean, they would be safer. They scrubbed the floors, washed their clothes, and removed anything that might carry the sickness. Some people burned old items or threw them away, thinking that this would help prevent the illness from returning. These actions were based on what they saw happening around them, but they did not always work. The disease continued to move through the land, and no one could find a way to stop it completely. Even with all the cleaning and burning, the illness found its way in, and people had to live with the constant fear of being infected. Some people thought that certain plants or herbs could protect them from getting sick. They used these in different ways. Some drank them, others rubbed them on their skin, and some carried them with them as a sign of protection. These remedies were passed down from older generations, and people believed that they had been used before to fight other illnesses. But none of these methods actually stopped the disease. The people who used them still became sick, and many of them died without knowing why. The belief in these remedies gave people hope, but it also made them feel more confused when nothing changed. They tried everything they could think of, but the illness still took lives, and this made them question whether any of their efforts had any real effect. There were also many ideas about how to stay safe outside the home. Some people avoided going to places where many people gathered, like markets or public squares. They stayed inside their houses most of the time, only leaving when they had to. Others tried to keep a distance from anyone who looked unwell, believing that staying away from sick people would keep them healthy. These efforts were meant to protect them, but they did not always work. The illness moved quickly, and even those who tried to avoid it often ended up getting sick anyway. This made people feel even more helpless, as they realized that no matter what they did, the disease was still coming for them. Some people believed that the illness was caused by bad air, so they tried to make their homes smell better. They burned incense, lit fires, and used strong-smelling substances to try to drive out the sickness. Others thought that the illness came from water, so they boiled their drinking water or avoided it altogether. These actions were based on what people thought they knew, but they did not stop the disease from spreading. The illness found its way into homes regardless of what people did, and this made them feel even more helpless. They watched as their efforts failed, and this added to the growing sense of despair that surrounded them. Many people tried to protect themselves by avoiding contact with others. They did not shake hands, did not sit close to each other, and did not share food or drinks. This created a sense of distance between people, making it harder for them to support each other. Without the comfort of human connection, many people felt lonely and afraid. The fear of the illness made it hard to trust others, and this added to the tension in communities. People who once lived together in harmony now watched each other carefully, unsure of who might be carrying the sickness. This isolation made it harder to care for the sick, and it left many people feeling abandoned and alone. There were also attempts to isolate the sick. Some families sent their sick members to live in separate rooms or buildings, hoping that this would keep the illness from spreading to others. Others built walls around their homes or set up barriers to prevent anyone from entering. These efforts were meant to protect the healthy, but they also made it harder for the sick to get care. Without proper help, many of them suffered alone, and some of them died without being able to receive any real treatment. The isolation created more suffering, and it made the illness even harder to deal with. People were forced to choose between protecting themselves and helping those who needed them most. Some people tried to use religious practices to protect themselves. They prayed for safety, read holy texts, and visited sacred places, believing that these actions would keep them from getting sick. Others made small offerings or performed rituals, thinking that these acts would bring them protection. These beliefs gave people a sense of control, even if they did not stop the illness. The fear of the disease made people turn to faith more than ever, and this helped them cope with the uncertainty of what was happening around them. Even though the illness continued to spread, they found comfort in their beliefs, and this gave them the strength to keep going. Despite all these efforts, nothing really worked. The illness continued to spread, taking more lives each day. People tried everything they could think of, but nothing changed the outcome. The disease was powerful, and it did not care about what people did to protect themselves. Even those who followed all the rules and took every precaution still ended up getting sick. This made it clear that the illness was something beyond their control, and it forced people to face the reality that they could not stop it on their own. The struggle was not just about finding a solution, it was about surviving in a world that had changed forever. The efforts to prevent infection showed how much people wanted to survive, but they also revealed how little they understood about the disease. They tried everything they could think of, but none of it helped. The illness moved forward, and people had to live with the knowledge that they could not stop it. The struggle was not just against the disease itself, it was against the fear, the uncertainty, and the loss that came with it. Every day brought new challenges, and every night brought the same heavy silence of grief and sorrow. The world had changed, and there was no going back to the way things used to be. The role of fear and uncertainty. Fear was a powerful force that shaped how people lived during the time of the illness. It moved through the land like the disease itself, spreading quickly and leaving behind confusion, panic, and doubt. People did not know where the sickness came from or how it spread, and this lack of understanding made them more afraid. Every new case of illness brought more worry, and every death added to the growing sense of dread that filled the air. Fear became a part of daily life, influencing decisions, actions, and even thoughts. The uncertainty about the illness made it hard for people to plan or act with confidence. They did not know when the next person would fall ill, nor did they know how long the sickness would last. This unknown future created a deep sense of helplessness. Some people stopped going outside, believing that staying inside would keep them safe. Others avoided others, thinking that by keeping their distance, they could protect themselves. But no one knew if these actions were truly helping, and this doubt only increased the fear. People lived in a constant state of anxiety, always wondering if they had done enough to stay safe. Fear also affected how people treated each other. Trust between neighbors and friends began to break down as people worried about who might be carrying the illness. Some families sent sick members away, not wanting to risk infecting others. Others refused to let anyone into their homes, even if it meant turning away those in need. These actions, while meant to protect, often caused more suffering. People who were already weak and sick found themselves alone, without care or support. The fear of the illness turned compassion into suspicion, making it harder for communities to come together in times of crisis. The emotional toll of the illness was immense. People watched as their loved ones fell ill and died, and this loss left deep scars on their hearts. Grief was everywhere, and it was difficult to find comfort in anything. Some people tried to cope by focusing on their faith, believing that God would protect them or that the illness was a test of their strength. Others turned to rituals, hoping that certain actions would bring them safety or relief. But even these efforts could not erase the pain. The fear of losing more people, of being the next to fall ill, kept many awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what the morning would bring. The uncertainty also led to a breakdown in normal routines. Schools closed, markets became empty, and public gatherings were avoided. People no longer felt safe in places they once considered familiar. Even simple tasks, like buying food or visiting a neighbor, became dangerous choices. The fear of the illness changed the way people moved through the world, making them cautious, hesitant, and uncertain of everything around them. Life was no longer about enjoying the present, it was about surviving the next day. Some people tried to find meaning in the illness, believing that it was a punishment for past sins or a sign of something greater happening in the world. Others saw it as a test of character, a challenge that required patience and strength. These beliefs gave some people a sense of purpose, but they also added to the confusion. If the illness was a punishment, then what had they done wrong? If it was a test, then what was the lesson they needed to learn? These questions had no clear answers, and this lack of certainty only deepened the fear. The fear of the illness also affected how people thought about their own health. Many people started to believe that any small symptom was a sign of the sickness. A fever, a cough, or even a headache could send them into a panic. They checked their bodies constantly, looking for signs that they were getting sick. This hyper-awareness made it hard to relax, and it created a cycle of fear that was hard to break. People lived in a constant state of worry, always expecting the worst. Even those who were healthy felt the weight of the illness. They saw the suffering around them and wondered if they were next. They heard stories of entire families being wiped out, and this made them question their own safety. The fear was not just about getting sick, it was about losing everything that made life worth living. People lost their homes, their jobs, and their relationships, all because of an illness they could not understand. The uncertainty of the situation made it impossible to feel secure, no matter what they did. The role of fear and uncertainty in this time was undeniable. It shaped every aspect of life, from the way people acted to the way they thought. It created division, isolation, and despair, but it also forced people to confront their deepest fears. In a world where nothing was certain, people had to rely on their own strength, their own beliefs, and their own hope. The illness did not stop, but neither did the human spirit. Even in the face of fear, people continued to live, to try, and to survive. The struggle against the illness was not just about finding a cure, it was about finding a way to keep going, even when the future seemed uncertain and the present was full of pain. Long-term consequences. The long-term consequences of the illness were deep and far-reaching, affecting not only individuals but also entire communities and societies. As the disease continued to spread, it left behind a trail of loss, suffering, and change that would shape the future for generations. Families were broken, with many losing multiple members in a short time. The emotional scars of these losses remained long after the illness had passed, as people struggled to cope with grief and uncertainty. The absence of loved ones created a sense of emptiness that could not be filled, and this pain became a part of daily life for those who survived. Communities were also deeply affected by the illness. Many villages and towns saw their populations shrink as people died or left in search of safety. Some places became almost deserted, with empty homes and quiet streets that once bustled with life. This decline in population had serious economic and social consequences. With fewer people to work the land, manage businesses, or provide services, many areas faced hardship. Trade slowed, food production decreased, and the overall quality of life declined. People who had once lived together in close-knit communities now found themselves isolated, struggling to rebuild what had been lost. The illness also changed the way people viewed health and medicine. Before the outbreak, there was little understanding of how diseases worked, and treatments were often based on superstition or tradition. But as the illness spread and no one could find a cure, people began to question these old beliefs. Some started to look for new ways to understand and treat illness, leading to the gradual development of more scientific approaches. This shift in thinking laid the foundation for future medical advancements, even though it took many years for real progress to be made. Religious and cultural practices were also affected by the long-term impact of the illness. Many people turned to faith during the outbreak, believing that prayer, rituals, and divine intervention could protect them from the sickness. However, as the illness continued to take lives, some began to lose faith in these practices. Others became more devout, seeking comfort in their beliefs. The tension between faith and science grew over time, as people tried to make sense of what had happened and how to prevent such events from happening again. This conflict between tradition and knowledge would continue to shape society for many years. The psychological effects of the illness were also significant. Many people developed a deep fear of illness, which influenced their behavior for years to come. They avoided contact with others, stayed indoors more often, and were hesitant to trust strangers. This fear extended beyond the immediate threat of the disease and affected how people interacted with each other. Trust was broken, and relationships were strained as people became more cautious and suspicious. Even after the illness had passed, the memory of its impact lingered, creating a lasting sense of unease. Economically, the long-term consequences of the illness were severe. With so many people dead or displaced, labor shortages became a major problem. Fields went untended, and businesses struggled to stay open. This led to increased poverty and hardship, especially in rural areas where people relied heavily on agriculture. In some regions, entire industries collapsed, and people were forced to find new ways to support themselves. This economic instability had ripple effects across society, making it difficult for people to recover and rebuild. Social structures were also disrupted by the illness. Traditional roles and responsibilities were altered as families were forced to adapt to new circumstances. Children who had lost parents had to grow up faster, taking on adult responsibilities before they were ready. Women, in particular, faced new challenges as they took on roles that had previously been held by men. These changes helped to reshape the way society functioned, but they also brought about new difficulties and uncertainties. The long-term consequences of the illness also included a greater awareness of public health. As people saw the devastation caused by the disease, they began to recognize the importance of hygiene, cleanliness, and preventive measures. This awareness led to changes in how communities were organized and how people lived. Public health initiatives, such as better sanitation and quarantine practices, became more common, even if they were still limited in scope. These efforts, while not always effective at the time, laid the groundwork for future improvements in public health systems. The illness also had a lasting impact on the way people thought about death. Before the outbreak, death was a natural part of life, but the sheer scale of the loss made it more difficult to accept. People were forced to confront the reality of mortality in a way they had not before, and this changed the way they viewed life and the future. Funerary practices, mourning traditions, and religious beliefs around death evolved as people sought ways to cope with the overwhelming loss. In the years following the outbreak, the lessons learned from the illness began to influence how people prepared for future threats. While the disease itself was eventually controlled, the fear it left behind remained. Communities became more cautious, and governments started to pay more attention to public health and disease prevention. Although these efforts were still in their early stages, they marked an important step toward a more organized and informed approach to managing health crises. The long-term consequences of the illness were not just physical or economic, they were also deeply personal. For those who had lost loved ones, the pain never fully went away. For those who had survived, the experience changed the way they lived and the way they viewed the world. The illness had taken much from them, but it had also taught them resilience, strength, and the importance of community. Even in the face of great loss, people found ways to move forward, to rebuild, and to remember those who had been taken. The legacy of the illness was not just in the damage it caused, but in the lessons it left behind, shaping the future of Europe in ways that would be felt for generations to come. The search for a cure. As the illness continued to spread, people began to look for ways to stop it. They did not know what caused the disease or how to treat it, but they were determined to find a solution. Some believed that if they could understand the illness better, they might be able to prevent it or cure it. Others thought that there was a secret remedy hidden in nature, waiting to be discovered. These ideas led to many attempts to find a way to fight the disease, even though most of them failed. Doctors and healers tried different treatments, hoping that something would work. Some used bloodletting, believing that removing blood from the body would help the sick feel better. Others gave patients strong herbal mixtures, thinking that these could strengthen their bodies and fight off the illness. But none of these methods worked well, and many people still died despite the efforts. The lack of scientific knowledge made it hard to know which treatments were useful and which were not, so people had to rely on guesswork and tradition. Some people turned to religious practices, believing that prayer and faith could bring healing. They visited holy places, read sacred texts, and performed rituals in hopes that the illness would leave them alone. Others made small offerings, thinking that these acts would please the gods and protect them from harm. While these beliefs gave some people comfort, they did not actually stop the disease from spreading. The illness continued to take lives, and people had to face the reality that no amount of prayer or ritual could change the outcome. There were also many superstitions about how to avoid getting sick. Some people believed that certain foods or drinks could protect them from the illness. Others avoided going outside when the wind blew in a particular direction, thinking that the sickness traveled with the air. Some thought that if they stayed inside all day, they would be safe. These ideas varied from place to place, but they all came from the same place: fear and a lack of understanding. People wanted to believe that there was something they could do to stay healthy, even if it was just a small gesture. Despite all these efforts, nothing really stopped the illness. It continued to move through the land, taking more lives each day. People who followed these beliefs often felt confused when the illness still came to them. This led to more fear and more questions about what was happening. Some people began to doubt their own beliefs, wondering if there was something else they could do to stay safe. The more they tried, the more they realized that their methods were not working, which only increased their frustration. The search for a cure led to new ideas and experiments. Some people started to study the illness more closely, trying to find patterns in how it spread. They watched the sick and recorded their symptoms, hoping that this information could help them find a solution. Others looked at the behavior of animals and plants, thinking that nature might hold the key to stopping the disease. These early attempts at observation and analysis were the first steps toward a more scientific approach to medicine, even though they were still limited by the knowledge of the time. There were also efforts to isolate the sick, believing that this would prevent the illness from spreading further. Some families sent their sick members to live in separate rooms or buildings, hoping that this would keep the disease from affecting others. Others built walls around their homes or set up barriers to prevent anyone from entering. These actions were meant to protect the healthy, but they also made it harder for the sick to get care. Without proper help, many of them suffered alone, and some of them died without being able to receive any real treatment. The isolation created more suffering, and it made the illness even harder to deal with. Some people tried to use religious practices to protect themselves. They prayed for safety, read holy texts, and visited sacred places, believing that these actions would keep them from getting sick. Others made small offerings or performed rituals, thinking that these acts would bring them protection. These beliefs gave people a sense of control, even if they did not stop the illness. The fear of the disease made people turn to faith more than ever, and this helped them cope with the uncertainty of what was happening around them. Even though the illness continued to spread, they found comfort in their beliefs, and this gave them the strength to keep going. Despite all these efforts, nothing really worked. The illness continued to spread, taking more lives each day. People tried everything they could think of, but nothing changed the outcome. The disease was powerful, and it did not care about what people did to protect themselves. Even those who followed all the rules and took every precaution still ended up getting sick. This made it clear that the illness was something beyond their control, and it forced people to face the reality that they could not stop it on their own. The struggle was not just about finding a solution, it was about surviving in a world that had changed forever. The search for a cure showed how much people wanted to survive, but it also revealed how little they understood about the disease. They tried everything they could think of, but none of it helped. The illness moved forward, and people had to live with the knowledge that they could not stop it. The struggle was not just against the disease itself, it was against the fear, the uncertainty, and the loss that came with it. Every day brought new challenges, and every night brought the same heavy silence of grief and sorrow. The world had changed, and there was no going back to the way things used to be. The end of the outbreak. The outbreak did not end in a single moment, but rather in a slow and uncertain way that left people still unsure of what had happened. It was not a sudden disappearance, nor was it marked by a clear turning point. Instead, the illness simply seemed to fade away over time, as if it had run out of people to take. Some said it had been stopped by the efforts of healers, others believed it had passed because of the prayers of the faithful, and some thought it had simply lost its strength. No one knew for sure, and this uncertainty added to the confusion that followed. As the illness began to decline, people were not sure how to react. Many had lived in fear for so long that they no longer knew how to feel safe again. They watched the streets with cautious eyes, waiting for the next sign of sickness, but nothing came. The silence that followed was strange, almost unnatural. For years, the world had been filled with the sound of crying, the sight of empty homes, and the weight of loss. Now, there was only quiet, and this quiet brought both relief and doubt. Some communities celebrated the end of the outbreak, believing it was a sign of divine favor or a reward for their suffering. They held small gatherings, lit fires, and sang songs of gratitude, hoping to mark the moment as a victory. Others remained cautious, afraid that the illness might return at any time. They kept their doors closed, avoided strangers, and continued to live with the same fears that had shaped their lives for so long. The memory of the illness was too strong to be forgotten, and many people carried its shadow with them for years to come. The end of the outbreak also brought changes in how people viewed the world. Before, life had been full of uncertainty, and death had always been a possibility. But after the illness, people saw things differently. They understood the fragility of life in a way they never had before, and this made them more aware of the value of health and safety. Some families became more protective of their children, while others took more care in their daily routines. The experience had changed them, and even those who had survived found themselves thinking about life in a new way. In some places, the outbreak led to lasting changes in how people lived. Communities that had been affected by the illness became more cautious, and this caution influenced how they built their homes, managed their food, and interacted with others. Some villages built walls around their homes, not just to keep out the sick, but to create a sense of security that had been lost during the outbreak. Others developed new traditions, such as regular cleaning rituals or special prayers for protection, as a way to remember what had happened and to prevent it from happening again. The medical field also changed in the years following the outbreak. Doctors and healers, who had once relied on superstition and guesswork, began to look for more practical ways to understand and treat illness. They studied the patterns of the disease, recorded what they saw, and tried to find connections between different cases. These early efforts laid the foundation for future medical discoveries, even though they were still limited by the knowledge of the time. The outbreak had shown that the old ways were not enough, and this realization helped to push medicine in a new direction. Religious beliefs also shifted in the wake of the illness. Some people turned to faith more than ever, believing that the outbreak had been a test of their devotion. Others, however, questioned their beliefs, wondering why the illness had taken so many lives despite their prayers and rituals. This conflict between faith and science would continue for many years, shaping the way people thought about health, healing, and the role of religion in society. The illness had challenged long-held ideas, and this challenge would have a lasting impact on the world. The emotional toll of the outbreak was not something that could be easily undone. Many people still carried the grief of those they had lost, and the pain of their memories lingered in their hearts. Some found comfort in remembering the lives that had been taken, while others struggled to move forward. The illness had left scars on individuals, families, and entire communities, and these scars would remain for generations. Even as life returned to normal, the past could not be erased, and the lessons learned from the outbreak would shape the future in ways that were not always visible. Despite everything, people found a way to rebuild. They started fresh, planting crops, rebuilding homes, and reaching out to each other in ways that had been difficult during the outbreak. The world had changed, but it had not ended. Life went on, and with it came hope. People remembered the suffering, but they also remembered the strength it had shown. They had survived, and this survival gave them a sense of purpose that would carry them forward. The end of the outbreak was not a happy moment, nor was it a complete victory. It was a moment of change, of reflection, and of quiet resilience. The illness had taken much, but it had also taught people something valuable. They had learned to be careful, to be kind, and to be grateful for the time they had. They had seen the worst of what life could bring, but they had also seen the best of what people could do when faced with hardship. In the years that followed, the story of the outbreak became part of history, passed down through stories, writings, and traditions. It was not just a tale of illness, but a tale of survival, of loss, and of the human spirit. The people who had lived through it carried its memory with them, and in doing so, they ensured that the lessons of the outbreak would not be forgotten. The world had changed, but so had the people who lived in it. And in the end, that was the most important thing of all. Food and taste in Europe around the year 1300. In the early part of the 14th century, people living across different regions of Europe had certain ideas about what made food enjoyable to eat, and these ideas were shaped by long-standing traditions, religious beliefs, seasonal availability, and the limited means of preserving ingredients for later use. Meals were not designed for entertainment or luxury in most households, and eating was seen more as a necessary activity to maintain strength and health rather than an opportunity for indulgence or celebration on a daily basis. The concept of flavor was tied closely to how familiar a dish felt, how warm it could be served, and whether it provided enough energy to last through hours of physical labor, which was common for the majority of the population at that time. There were no electric stoves or refrigerators, so cooking required gathering wood, lighting fires, and using heavy pots that took a long time to heat up, making the process slow and repetitive throughout the week. Most families lived in small homes with little space for storing food, so they relied on buying or gathering ingredients every few days, depending on where they lived and what kind of work they did during the week. In villages, people often grew their own vegetables in small plots near their houses, while those in towns depended more on markets where vendors sold items like onions, carrots, cabbages, and dried beans that had been stored from earlier harvests. Meat was not eaten every day by most people because animals were expensive to raise and feed, and butchering one meant losing a source of milk, eggs, or wool unless it was absolutely necessary. Instead, meals were built around grains such as barley, rye, and oats, which were turned into thick porridges or coarse bread baked in communal ovens shared by several families in the same area. These grain-based dishes formed the foundation of nearly every meal, and they were often mixed with whatever else was available at the time, including herbs picked from nearby fields or scraps of salted fish brought in from coastal regions. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, and saffron existed but were extremely costly and mostly used by wealthy households or in monasteries where monks prepared special meals for visiting dignitaries or religious holidays. For ordinary people, taste came more from the texture of food and the warmth it brought to the body than from complex seasoning or elaborate preparation methods. A piece of dark bread soaked in broth made from boiled bones and leftover vegetables was considered satisfying not because it tasted exciting but because it filled the stomach and helped a person feel less cold during the winter months when temperatures dropped and daylight became shorter. Dairy products such as cheese and sour milk were common in some areas, especially where cows or goats could graze on open land, but they spoiled quickly without refrigeration, so they were consumed soon after being made. Butter was rare and usually reserved for special occasions or medicinal purposes, such as rubbing it on dry skin or mixing it with herbs believed to help with coughs and sore throats. Fruits like apples, pears, and plums grew wild or were cultivated in orchards belonging to nobles or churches, and they were eaten fresh when in season or dried for use during colder times of the year when fresh produce was unavailable. Honey was the main sweetener since sugar was imported from distant lands and too expensive for regular use, and even honey was used sparingly except during festivals or religious celebrations when extra treats were allowed. Water was drunk by many, but it was often unsafe due to contamination, so weak beer or small amounts of wine diluted with water were common beverages even among children, as fermentation killed some harmful organisms and made the liquid safer to consume over time. Cooking techniques remained simple and unchanged for generations, with boiling being the most frequent method because it required only a pot, a fire, and basic tools that almost every household owned. Roasting meat over an open flame happened occasionally, but only when fuel was plentiful and there was enough food to justify the effort of preparing it in that way. Baking in clay ovens or stone hearths occurred mainly in larger homes or institutions like castles and abbeys, where servants worked together to prepare meals for large groups of people who followed strict schedules based on prayer times and daylight hours. Food was rarely eaten alone, and meals were typically shared among family members or co-workers sitting together at wooden tables or benches, passing bowls and cups from one person to another without much concern for individual portions or hygiene standards as understood today. Utensils were minimal, with spoons made of wood or bone being the most common, while forks were almost unknown and knives were carried by individuals for personal use during meals and other daily tasks. Plates did not exist in the modern sense, so food was placed on thick slices of stale bread called trenchers, which absorbed juices and were later given to animals or the poor after the meal ended. Cleaning up after eating involved wiping hands on cloth or grass and sweeping crumbs off surfaces with brooms made of bundled twigs tied to sticks collected from nearby trees. Leftovers were saved whenever possible, added to soups or stews the next day, or fed to pigs and chickens kept outside the home to reduce waste and make use of every bit of edible material. Preservation methods included drying, salting, smoking, and storing in cool cellars or underground pits lined with straw to keep temperature stable, though mold and insects often damaged supplies before they could be fully used. Trade routes brought some exotic items like almonds, figs, raisins, and vinegar to urban centers, but these were still uncommon in rural areas where self-sufficiency was key to survival. Religious rules also influenced what people ate and when they ate it, as fasting periods required avoiding meat, dairy, and eggs for weeks at a time, especially during Lent and other holy seasons observed by the Christian Church. During these times, meals became even simpler, relying heavily on fish, legumes, and vegetables cooked in water or oil pressed from olives if it could be obtained. Fish was eaten more frequently in regions near rivers, lakes, and oceans, where nets and traps were used to catch species like herring, cod, and eel, which were then salted or smoked to extend their shelf life. Some monastic communities maintained fish ponds where they raised carp and other freshwater varieties specifically for consumption on fast days, demonstrating how deeply faith and diet were connected in everyday life. Seasonal changes played a major role in determining what foods were available, with spring and summer offering fresh greens, herbs, and young animals, while autumn brought harvested grains, fruits, and root vegetables stored for winter use. Winter itself was a time of scarcity for many, and people relied on preserved foods, occasional hunting, and charity from wealthier neighbors or church-supported kitchens to survive until the ground thawed and new crops could be planted. Hunger was a constant concern, and entire communities suffered during years of poor harvest caused by bad weather, pests, or war, which disrupted farming and transportation networks essential for food distribution. Despite these challenges, people developed routines around mealtimes that gave structure to their days, rising early to begin work before sunrise and gathering for a main meal in the middle of the day when energy levels needed replenishing. Evening meals were lighter, often consisting of leftovers warmed again or simple snacks like bread with cheese or a boiled egg if one was available. Children learned from an early age how to help prepare food, gather firewood, watch over cooking pots, and avoid burning meals, which would mean going hungry or wasting valuable resources already in short supply. Elders passed down knowledge about which plants were safe to eat, how to tell when meat had gone bad, and which combinations of ingredients might cause stomach discomfort or illness, all based on experience rather than scientific understanding. Superstitions also played a role in food choices, with some believing that certain foods brought good luck, protected against disease, or angered divine forces if consumed at the wrong time. Eating habits varied widely between social classes, with nobles enjoying more variety, better quality ingredients, and access to imported goods, while peasants and laborers focused on filling their stomachs with affordable, durable foods that required little preparation. Still, the idea of taste was not defined by richness or novelty but by consistency, safety, and the ability of a meal to sustain the body through another day of routine existence. Meals were rarely discussed in detail, and there were no cookbooks written for ordinary people, so recipes were shared orally and changed slowly over time as new tools, crops, or influences entered local communities. Travelers sometimes brought stories of foreign dishes, but these were often met with suspicion or indifference unless they aligned with existing customs and ingredient availability. Overall, the experience of eating in Europe around the year 1300 was marked by simplicity, repetition, and practicality, with little emphasis on surprise, excitement, or personal preference in flavor. Food was a necessity first, and any enjoyment derived from it came from its warmth, its familiarity, and its role in bringing people together briefly during otherwise long and tiring days. Grains as the foundation of medieval diets. In the daily lives of people living in Europe during the years between 1300 and 1400, grains played a central role in nearly every meal consumed across all regions regardless of climate, terrain, or local customs, and this reliance on cereal crops was so deeply embedded in everyday existence that it shaped not only what people ate but also how they worked, when they rested, and how entire communities organized their yearly routines around planting, tending, harvesting, drying, storing, grinding, and preparing these essential ingredients that formed the bulk of their caloric intake and provided the primary source of energy needed to endure long days of physical labor in fields, workshops, homes, and marketplaces where little else besides bread, porridge, or gruel could be counted on to appear with any regularity or consistency. The most common grains grown during this period included rye, barley, oats, and wheat, each of which had its own characteristics, growing conditions, and uses depending on the region, soil quality, rainfall patterns, and social status of the people who cultivated or purchased them, and while some areas favored one type over another due to environmental factors such as wetness, cold, or poor drainage, most households used whatever grain was available locally because transportation was slow. Roads were often impassable, and buying food from distant places was expensive and unreliable except for those who lived near rivers, trade routes, or larger towns where merchants occasionally brought sacks of imported flour or unmilled kernels from neighboring territories. Rye was especially widespread in northern and eastern Europe, where the cooler temperatures and heavier soils made it easier to grow than wheat, and although rye produced a dense, dark loaf with a slightly sour taste and coarse texture, it was valued for its ability to survive harsh winters and yield a harvest even when other crops failed, making it a dependable staple for peasants, servants, and laborers who could not afford to take risks with less resilient plants that required richer soil. Careful tending, and protection from pests, frost, or flooding that frequently damaged fields and left families without enough food to last through the winter months when fresh supplies were unavailable and stored provisions began to run low. Barley was another widely used grain, often boiled into thick porridges or mixed with vegetables, scraps of meat, or fish to create filling stews that could be stretched to feed many mouths with minimal ingredients, and since barley matured quickly and grew well in poor quality soil, it was commonly planted in areas where nothing else would thrive, though it was generally considered less desirable than wheat or rye for baking bread because it did not rise well, stuck to cooking pots, and produced a gummy consistency that many found unpleasant unless combined with other flours or thoroughly strained after boiling. Oats were primarily grown in wetter climates such as parts of Britain, Ireland, and northern France, where frequent rain made wheat cultivation difficult, and they were usually eaten as porridge, cooked slowly over a fire until soft and creamy, or dried and stored for later use during seasons when fresh milk or butter might be added if any could be spared, though more often they were prepared plain with water and a pinch of salt if any could be spared, and despite their nutritional value, oats were sometimes seen as animal feed rather than human food in certain regions, especially among wealthier classes who associated them with poverty, rural backwardness, or the diets of soldiers and travelers who carried them on long journeys because they were lightweight, non-perishable, and easy to prepare with minimal equipment. Wheat, when it could be grown successfully, was regarded as the most desirable grain because it produced lighter, softer bread with a finer crumb and a milder flavor compared to the heavier loaves made from rye or barley, and white wheat bread was particularly prized by nobles, clergy, and wealthy town dwellers who could afford both the high cost of finely sifted flour and the fuel required to bake it properly in ovens that maintained consistent heat over several hours. But for most ordinary people, access to pure wheat was limited, and even when it was available, it was often mixed with cheaper grains to stretch the supply and reduce expenses, resulting in hybrid loaves known as Maslin bread, which combined wheat and rye in varying proportions depending on availability, harvest success, and economic conditions that fluctuated from year to year based on weather, war, disease, or changes in taxation imposed by local rulers or feudal overlords who claimed a portion of each harvest as rent or tribute for the right to farm the land. Harvesting grain was a labor-intensive process that involved cutting stalks by hand using sickles or scythes, gathering them into sheaves, transporting them to threshing floors where animals trampled over them to separate the edible kernels from the chaff, winnowing the mixture by tossing it into the air so that the wind would blow away the lighter husks while the heavier grains fell back down onto cloths or wooden surfaces, and then bagging or boxing the clean grain for storage in barns, cellars, or communal granaries that were vulnerable to dampness, mold, rodents, and theft if not carefully guarded and regularly inspected throughout the year. Once harvested and stored, grain had to be ground into flour before it could be used for cooking, and this task was typically done at home using hand-operated corn stones made of two circular rocks stacked together, the top one rotated manually to crush the kernels beneath it, producing a coarse powder that retained much of the bran and germ and gave bread a gritty texture and darker color than modern refined flours, though some villages had access to water-powered or wind-powered mills, operated by millers who charged a fee for their services, usually taking a small percentage of the grain as payment for grinding it into a slightly finer product that still contained impurities such as bits of stone, dust, or insect fragments that could not be fully removed without advanced sifting techniques that did not exist at the time. Baking bread was one of the most important household activities, and in many places, families did not have private ovens but instead relied on shared communal ovens located in central areas of villages or within monastery grounds, where residents brought their dough on designated days and waited their turn to place it inside the heated chamber after the previous batch had finished baking and the temperature had been adjusted by experienced bakers who judged readiness by touch, smell, and experience rather than precise measurements or timers. And since maintaining an even heat was difficult, especially in ovens built from clay or stone that absorbed and released warmth unevenly, loaves often emerged partially burned on the outside and undercooked within, requiring further toasting over open flames or slicing and drying to prevent spoilage. Bread itself came in many forms depending on region, class, and occasion, ranging from large round loaves baked once a week and sliced as needed to small flatbreads cooked quickly on hot stones near fires, and while rich households might enjoy softer, wider bread served on clean cloths with knives and spoons, poorer families ate dense, heavy loaves that lasted longer but were hard to chew, sometimes needing to be soaked in broth, milk, or ale to soften them enough for consumption, especially by children, the elderly, or those suffering from dental problems caused by poor hygiene, worn teeth, or chronic illness. Porridge was another common way of preparing grain, particularly for breakfast or evening meals, and it was made by slowly stirring crushed or coarsely ground kernels into boiling water or milk until they thickened into a mushy consistency that could be flavored with salt, honey, dried fruit, or leftover fat if any was available, though most versions were plain and monotonous, eaten out of wooden bowls with spoons carved from scrap wood or animal bone, and often reheated multiple times over several days until the original texture broke down completely and the dish became more like a sticky paste than a proper meal. Storage of grain was a constant concern, as damp conditions encouraged mold growth, insects infested stored sacks, and mice or rats could consume significant portions of a family's supply overnight if containers were not sealed properly in chests made of wood, pottery jars coated with resin, or pits dug into dry ground and lined with straw to absorb moisture and keep temperatures stable. And even with precautions, losses were common, forcing households to ration their flour during lean periods and rely on alternative foods such as roots, greens, or legumes until the next harvest brought fresh supplies. Because grain was so vital to survival, its production and distribution were closely tied to social structure, land ownership, and religious observance, with feudal lords controlling large estates where peasants worked the fields in exchange for permission to keep a portion of the crop for themselves, while churches collected tithes in the form of grain that supported priests, monks, and charitable kitchens that fed the poor, sick, or homeless during times of famine or crisis, reinforcing the idea that food was not merely sustenance but also a symbol of duty, obedience, and divine order in a world where stability depended on everyone fulfilling their assigned role without question or complaint. Meals centered around grain were rarely varied, and people accepted that they would eat similar dishes day after day with only slight differences based on season, location, or special events such as weddings, funerals, or religious festivals when extra effort might be made to produce a better loaf, add a bit of honey, or serve warm porridge with melted butter, though even these occasions did not dramatically alter the overall pattern of eating, which remained rooted in repetition, necessity, and quiet endurance rather than pleasure, novelty, or personal choice. The act of preparing grain-based food was repetitive and time-consuming, involving hours of kneading dough, watching pots, cleaning tools, and managing fires, and women and children bore most of this responsibility, passing down knowledge about consistency, rising times, oven heat, and storage methods through observation and practice rather than written instruction, since literacy was rare and cookbooks did not exist for common households. Over time, small changes occurred in how grain was processed and used, such as the gradual improvement of mill technology, the introduction of new strains of wheat through trade or marriage alliances between noble families, or the adoption of slightly different recipes influenced by contact with travelers, pilgrims, or returning soldiers. But these shifts happened so slowly that individuals might live their entire lives without noticing any meaningful difference in the taste, texture, or appearance of the bread or porridge they consumed every day. For most people, the concept of flavor in grain-based dishes was not linked to richness, sweetness, or complexity but to familiarity, warmth, and fullness, and a piece of slightly stale bread dipped in thin soup was considered satisfying not because it tasted good in any exciting way but because it filled the stomach, required no chewing effort if softened first, and reminded the eater of countless other meals just like it that had sustained them through childhood, adulthood, and old age in a cycle of quiet repetition that defined the rhythm of life in medieval Europe. There was little discussion about improving taste, inventing new recipes, or experimenting with ingredients, because the purpose of food was not to entertain or inspire but to preserve life, maintain strength, and allow people to continue working, praying, sleeping, and eventually dying in the same unremarkable way that generations before them had done, leaving behind few records, fewer memories, and almost no trace of what exactly they thought about the bread they ate each morning or the porridge they stirred each evening as the fire dimmed and the room grew cold. Vegetables, herbs, and wild plants in daily meals in the households of people living across Europe during the 14th century, vegetables played a supporting role in most meals, rarely taking center stage but instead serving as additions to grain-based dishes that relied on bread, porridge, or boiled grains as the primary source of sustenance, and although vegetables were consumed regularly by both rural and urban populations, they were not considered essential in the same way that grains or preserved foods were, and their presence on the table depended heavily on the time of year, local growing conditions, access to garden space, and the overall economic situation of the family preparing the meal, which meant that availability could vary greatly from one region to another and even from one week to the next depending on weather patterns, soil quality, or disruptions caused by war, disease, or migration that affected planting schedules and harvest yields in unpredictable ways. Commonly grown vegetables included cabbage, onions, leeks, garlic, carrots, turnips, parsnips, and beans, all of which were hardy enough to survive in temperate climates and could be stored for limited periods without spoiling if kept in cool, dry places such as cellars, root pits, or underground storage chambers dug beneath homes or barns where temperatures remained relatively stable throughout the winter months when fresh produce was no longer available from fields or gardens. Cabbage was one of the most widely used vegetables because it grew well in many types of soil, required little maintenance once planted, and could be harvested late into the fall or even early winter before freezing temperatures made it inedible, and it was often chopped finely and added to soups, stews, or pottages, thick mixtures of grain, water, fat, and whatever else was on hand, that simmered for hours over low fires in heavy iron or clay pots suspended above open flames or placed directly on hot stones near hearths where heat radiated unevenly and required constant attention to prevent burning or sticking. Onions and garlic were valued not only for their ability to add mild flavor to otherwise bland dishes but also for their long shelf life and resistance to rot, and they were frequently dried after harvest and hung in bundles from rafters or beams inside homes where air circulated freely and moisture levels were lower, allowing them to remain usable for several months, though they often became shriveled, soft, or moldy over time and had to be inspected carefully before being cut and added to cooking pots where even small amounts could subtly alter the taste of a dish without drawing attention to themselves or overwhelming other ingredients. Carrots at this time were not the bright orange variety familiar today but rather purple, yellow, or white roots that were smaller, tougher, and more fibrous, and they were usually boiled until soft or grated into mixtures that included other vegetables, grains, or scraps of meat to stretch the volume of food served to larger groups of people sharing a single pot. Beans and peas, whether fresh in season or dried for later use, were important sources of protein for those who could not afford meat on a regular basis, and they were typically soaked in water overnight to rehydrate them before being boiled slowly into mushy textures that blended easily with fats, herbs, or leftover broth, forming the base of many humble meals eaten in silence or with minimal conversation during brief pauses in daily labor. Turnips and parsnips were often grown together in kitchen gardens or cultivated plots near homes, and they provided a starchy, slightly sweet component to meals that helped balance the acidity of fermented foods or the saltiness of preserved fish and meats, and since they could be left in the ground for weeks after maturity without spoiling, they were sometimes dug up gradually as needed, though this practice carried risks if the soil froze too deeply or if animals disturbed the beds during cold nights when hunger drove them closer to human settlements in search of food. In addition to cultivated crops, many families relied on wild plants gathered from forests, meadows, riverbanks, and uncultivated fields, where knowledgeable individuals, often older women or children taught by elders, collected edible greens such as nettles, sorrel, dandelion leaves, chickweed, and wild mustard, all of which could be boiled and eaten like spinach or mixed into grain dishes to increase bulk and provide trace nutrients that might otherwise be missing from diets dominated by starch and fat. Nettles, despite their painful sting when touched raw, were particularly common in springtime meals, when stored supplies ran low and fresh growth emerged early in the season, and they were carefully picked using gloves made of cloth or leather, then washed and cooked thoroughly to neutralize their irritants before being stirred into porridges or combined with onions and fat to create simple side dishes that required no seasoning beyond salt if it was available. Herbs such as parsley, sage, thyme, mint, and fennel were grown in small clusters near doorways or along fences where they were easy to reach, and while some were used sparingly to add subtle notes to food, most were not employed for flavoring in the modern sense but rather for perceived health benefits, as many people believed certain plants could aid digestion, cleanse the blood, or protect against illness when consumed regularly, even if their actual effect was minimal or entirely symbolic. Parsley, for example, was thought to help with stomach discomfort and bad breath, so it was often chewed after meals or added to dishes near the end of cooking, while sage was associated with longevity and mental clarity, leading some to include it in teas or broths intended for the elderly or sick. Mint was appreciated for its cooling sensation and pleasant smell, especially during warmer months when food spoiled quickly and strong odors filled homes, and it was sometimes placed in storage areas to repel insects or laid between layers of cloth to keep clothing smelling fresh, though it was also used in cooking when nothing else was available. The preparation of vegetables was generally simple and repetitive, involving peeling when possible, chopping with dull knives on wooden boards stained with years of use, and boiling in large quantities of water until soft enough to eat. And since fuel was expensive and firewood had to be collected by hand, multiple ingredients were often cooked together in the same pot to save time, effort, and resources, resulting in meals where flavors blended together indistinctly and individual components lost their original characteristics through prolonged exposure to heat and liquid. Frying was rare because oil and animal fat were precious commodities reserved for special occasions or medicinal uses, and roasting vegetables separately from other foods was almost unheard of due to the inefficiency of using fire for anything other than essential tasks like baking bread or heating water for washing. Most vegetable dishes were served lukewarm or at room temperature, having cooled during the long gap between cooking and eating, and they were eaten from shared bowls using spoons made of wood, horn, or bone, with fingers occasionally used to pick out larger pieces or adjust portions when necessary. Preservation methods for vegetables were limited and largely ineffective by modern standards, with drying being the most common technique for items like beans, peas, and certain herbs, while root vegetables were stored in sand, straw, or sawdust to slow decay and maintain moisture, though mold, sprouting, and insect damage were frequent problems that reduced usable quantities over time. Pickling existed but was uncommon among ordinary households due to the cost of vinegar, which had to be imported or produced locally in small batches from wine or apple scraps, and brining required large amounts of salt, which was also expensive and closely regulated in many regions, making these methods accessible mainly to wealthier families or institutions such as monasteries and castles where supplies were more secure and waste could be better managed. As a result, most vegetables were consumed fresh during their growing season, and people accepted that their diet would become increasingly monotonous during winter and early spring when only dried legumes, stored roots, and occasional imports provided any variation from the usual bread and broth routine. There was little emphasis placed on presentation, variety, or culinary creativity when it came to vegetables, and meals were not judged by how appetizing they looked or tasted but by how effectively they filled the stomach and sustained energy levels through another day of physical work, prayer, or household duties that followed predictable patterns with few surprises or deviations. Children learned from an early age to eat whatever was given to them without complaint, and parents discouraged pickiness by reminding them of times when food was scarce and even spoiled vegetables or bitter greens had to be eaten to avoid starvation, reinforcing the idea that gratitude and endurance were more important than personal preference or enjoyment. Religious beliefs also influenced attitudes toward plant-based foods, as fasting periods required abstaining from meat, dairy, and eggs, making vegetables, legumes, and grains the sole components of meals for extended stretches of time, particularly during Lent and other holy observances when entire communities adhered to strict dietary rules that emphasized simplicity, humility, and self-denial as spiritual practices meant to purify the body and strengthen faith. During these times, vegetable dishes were prepared in much the same way as usual, with no attempt to mimic the texture or flavor of meat or to make the food more appealing, and people accepted the repetition and blandness as part of their religious duty, rarely expressing dissatisfaction or longing for richer fare. Markets in towns and cities sometimes offered a slightly wider selection of vegetables brought in from surrounding villages or transported along rivers by boat, but these items were often wilted, damaged, or overpriced, limiting access for poorer residents who relied on homegrown produce or charity distributions organized by churches and charitable organizations that provided basic rations during times of hardship. Cooking knowledge was passed down orally from generation to generation, with young girls learning how to identify edible plants, prepare them safely, and combine them with other ingredients under the supervision of mothers or grandmothers who had spent decades mastering the same routines without ever writing anything down or consulting outside sources. Since literacy was rare and printed materials did not exist for domestic topics like food preparation. Over time, small changes occurred in gardening practices and ingredient combinations due to contact with travelers, returning crusaders, or merchants who introduced new ideas about cultivation or usage, but these influences spread slowly and were often adapted to fit existing customs rather than replacing them outright, so the overall pattern of vegetable consumption remained remarkably consistent throughout the century. For most people, the experience of eating vegetables was unremarkable and forgettable, blending into the background of daily life like breathing or walking, and no one remembered exactly what they had eaten yesterday or expected anything different tomorrow, because the rhythm of meals was governed by necessity, tradition, and the slow turning of the seasons rather than choice, desire, or innovation, and this quiet continuity provided a sense of stability in a world where change was often dangerous, unwelcome, and best avoided whenever possible. In the everyday lives of people living in Europe during the years between 1300 and 1400, meat was not a regular part of most diets and was instead regarded as a rare addition to meals that occurred only on special occasions, during certain seasons, or among those who had enough wealth, land, or social status to afford it on a somewhat predictable basis, while for the majority of the population, especially peasants, laborers, and urban workers, eating meat was an infrequent event that might happen once every few weeks or even less often depending on location, economic conditions, religious restrictions, and access to animals that could be slaughtered without causing long-term hardship to the household relying on them for milk, eggs, wool, or plowing fields. The types of animals consumed varied by region and availability, with pigs, sheep, goats, cattle, chickens, geese, and ducks being the most common sources of meat, and each had its own role in the agricultural economy that extended far beyond food, meaning that killing an animal was never done lightly and usually required careful planning, permission from landowners in some cases, and consideration of how the loss would affect future productivity, especially if the animal was young, healthy, or still capable of producing offspring or labor for several more years. Pigs were among the most frequently eaten animals because they grew quickly, required relatively little care compared to other livestock, could be fed on scraps, acorns gathered from forests, and waste products from grain processing, and produced large amounts of fat and meat when slaughtered, making them ideal for preservation through salting, smoking, or drying, which allowed families to store portions for use during winter months when fresh food was scarce and hunting was difficult due to snow, ice, and short daylight hours. Sheep and goats provided wool, milk, and cheese in addition to meat, so they were usually kept alive as long as possible unless they became too old to produce or injured in ways that made recovery unlikely, and when they were finally butchered, nearly every part of the animal was used, including organs, blood, bones, and skin, with nothing discarded unless it showed clear signs of disease or decay that made it unsafe to consume. Cattle were valuable for their strength in plowing fields and transporting goods, so they were rarely killed for meat except in cases of extreme need, old age, or injury, and when one was slaughtered, it was often a community event where neighbors gathered to help with the work, share in the distribution of cuts, and participate in rituals or traditions meant to express gratitude for the animal's life and ensure that no part went to waste, reinforcing the idea that meat was not simply food but also a resource tied to survival, cooperation, and respect for natural cycles. Chickens and other poultry were kept in small numbers by many households, primarily for their eggs, but they were also eaten when they stopped laying, became sick, or reached an age where continued care was no longer practical, and while individual birds did not provide much meat, they could be added to soups, stews, or grain mixtures to enhance flavor and nutrition without requiring significant preparation or fuel. Hunting was another source of meat, though it was largely restricted to nobles and landowners who held exclusive rights to hunt on certain lands, and common people who hunted without permission risked severe punishment, including fines, imprisonment, or physical harm, so most rural residents relied on trapping small game such as rabbits, hares, birds, or squirrels using snares, nets, or simple tools made from wood and rope, and these animals, though small in size, contributed important protein to diets that otherwise depended heavily on grains, legumes, and preserved foods. Wild boar, deer, and other large animals were occasionally caught in forests or open fields, but they were typically claimed by local lords or shared among high-ranking officials, leaving little for ordinary families unless they received portions as gifts, rewards, or charity during festivals or religious celebrations when surplus meat might be distributed to gain favor or demonstrate generosity. Butchering an animal was a labor-intensive process that required skill, sharp tools, strong hands, and knowledge of anatomy to ensure that the meat was removed cleanly, organs were set aside for immediate use, and blood was collected for making sausages or puddings that could be cooked later, and since refrigeration did not exist, the entire process had to take place quickly and efficiently, usually in cold weather when lower temperatures slowed spoilage and allowed meat to remain safe for several days before being preserved. Preservation methods included salting, drying, smoking, and packing in fat, all of which helped extend shelf life but altered the taste, texture, and appearance of the meat significantly, often making it tough, salty, or dry by the time it was finally cooked and eaten, sometimes weeks or even months after slaughter. Salted pork, known as bacon or gammon, was one of the most common preserved meats and could be stored for long periods in wooden barrels or hung from rafters in cool rooms where air circulated freely, and it was usually soaked in water for hours or days before cooking to reduce salt content and rehydrate the fibers, then boiled slowly with vegetables, grains, or herbs to make stews that softened the meat and blended flavors into a uniform mixture where individual ingredients lost their distinctiveness over time. Fresh meat, when available, was typically boiled rather than roasted because boiling required less fuel, allowed multiple items to be cooked together, and made tough cuts more tender through prolonged exposure to liquid and heat, while roasting was reserved for wealthier households that could afford both the firewood and the space needed for open flame cooking, often done in large halls with high ceilings to manage smoke and accommodate big joints of meat turned on spits by servants working for hours to keep them rotating evenly. Meat dishes were rarely seasoned with anything beyond onions, garlic, or basic herbs like parsley or sage, and spices such as pepper, cinnamon, or saffron were almost never used by ordinary people due to their extreme cost and limited availability, so flavor came more from fat, bone broth, and the slow blending of ingredients than from deliberate attempts to create complex tastes or aromatic combinations. Meals containing meat were usually shared among family members or neighbors, with portions distributed according to age, status, and contribution to household labor, and children often received smaller pieces or were given soup made from boiled bones while adults ate the solid parts, reflecting social hierarchies that govern not only food distribution but also daily interactions within homes and communities. For many, the experience of eating meat was not associated with pleasure or excitement but with relief, fullness, and temporary satisfaction after periods of scarcity or physical strain, and there was little discussion about taste, preparation, or preference because expectations were low and alternatives were limited, so even tough, greasy, or overly salty meat was accepted without complaint as a sign of good fortune or divine blessing. Religious rules also played a major role in determining when meat could be eaten, as the Christian Church imposed numerous fasting days throughout the year when believers were required to abstain from all animal products, including meat, dairy, and eggs, especially during Lent, Advent, and certain weekdays like Fridays and Wednesdays, and these restrictions applied to everyone regardless of class, meaning that even wealthy individuals had to adjust their diets seasonally and rely on fish, legumes, and vegetables during extended periods when meat was forbidden, reinforcing the idea that dietary choices were not personal but moral, spiritual, and deeply embedded in communal rhythms of worship, penance, and self-denial. As a result, meat consumption followed a cyclical pattern tied to the liturgical calendar, with spikes in activity around major holidays like Christmas, Easter, and Saints' Days when feasting was permitted and encouraged as a way of celebrating faith and abundance, though even these events rarely involved extravagant displays for most people, who continued to eat modestly and pragmatically even on festive occasions. Cooking meat required constant attention to avoid burning, undercooking, or wasting precious fuel, and pots were often left simmering for hours or even days, with additional water or broth added as needed to prevent drying out, and since kitchen tools were basic and cleaning was infrequent, residue built up over time on pots, spoons, and cutting surfaces, contributing to a persistent smell of grease and old food that lingered in homes regardless of ventilation or efforts to remove it. Leftovers were reused whenever possible, added to new batches of stew, mixed into porridge, or served cold the next day, and bones were saved to make broth for future meals, ensuring that nothing was wasted and every bit of edible material was extracted through repeated heating and straining. There was little variation in how meat was prepared across regions, and recipes were passed down orally rather than written, so changes occurred very slowly over generations, with new techniques, tools, or ingredient combinations taking decades to become common practice, if they were adopted at all. Over time, some influence came from trade, travel, and contact with other cultures, especially in port cities or areas near monasteries where monks experimented with different methods of preservation or preparation, but these innovations rarely reached rural populations, who continued to follow traditional routines without questioning or seeking improvement. For most people, meat remained a background element of diet rather than a central focus, appearing irregularly and consumed quietly, without celebration or commentary, and no one remembered exactly when they last ate it or expected it to return soon, because the rhythm of life was shaped by necessity, routine, and acceptance of limitation rather than desire, novelty, or indulgence, and this quiet endurance defined the way food was experienced in medieval Europe, where satisfaction came not from richness or variety but from continuity, predictability, and the simple act of surviving another day without hunger. Fish, fasting, and religious influence on diet in the daily lives of people living in Europe during the years between 1300 and 1400. Fish played a significant role in diets, especially in regions near rivers, lakes, or coastal areas where access to fresh or preserved seafood was more consistent than in inland or mountainous regions, and while fish was not as commonly consumed as grains, vegetables, or meat in most households, it was an essential component of meals for many, particularly during periods of religious fasting when the Christian Church prohibited the consumption of meat, dairy, and eggs, and required believers to eat only plant-based foods or fish as alternatives that were considered less luxurious and therefore more appropriate for spiritual reflection, penance, and humility. The most commonly eaten fish included herring, cod, mackerel, eel, and salmon, all of which were available in different seasons depending on migration patterns, water temperatures, and local fishing practices, and they were often caught using simple methods such as nets, traps, spears, or lines made from animal sinew or woven grass, with larger catches sometimes stored in barrels filled with salt, vinegar, or brine to preserve them for longer periods and allow for distribution to communities that had no direct access to fresh water sources or reliable fishing grounds. Salted and dried fish were particularly valuable because they could be kept for months without spoiling, and they were used to supplement diets during times of scarcity, especially in winter when other food sources became limited due to cold weather, snow-covered fields, and reduced availability of fresh produce. And even though these preserved fish were often tough, dry, and heavily seasoned, they provided a necessary source of protein and nutrients that helped sustain people through long periods of hardship and uncertainty. In coastal towns and villages, fishing was a primary occupation for many families, and small boats were used to catch fish in open waters, while in inland areas, rivers and streams were the main sources of supply, with some communities maintaining fish ponds or reservoirs where carp, pike, or other freshwater species were raised specifically for consumption during fasting days or special occasions, and these ponds were carefully managed by monks, landowners, or local authorities who understood the importance of maintaining a steady supply of food for both religious and practical purposes. The preparation of fish varied depending on location, season, and available resources, but boiling, stewing, and drying were the most common methods used, with fish often cooked in large pots alongside vegetables, grains, or legumes to create hearty stews that could feed multiple people at once. And since firewood was expensive and cooking required constant attention, many families reused the same pot for several meals, adding new ingredients and reusing old broth until the mixture became thick, murky, and difficult to distinguish from previous batches, creating a uniform texture and flavor that did not change much over time. Smoked fish was another popular option, especially in colder climates where the air remained cool enough to prevent spoilage, and it was often hung in open spaces or placed in wooden racks near fires to dry slowly, producing a firm, chewy consistency that could be eaten directly or softened by soaking in water before being added to soups or porridges, though this process sometimes took hours or even days, and the final result was rarely as appetizing as fresh fish, which was usually reserved for wealthier households or special occasions where preservation was not necessary. For those who lived far from water sources or could not afford to buy fish regularly, the idea of eating it was often associated with religious observance rather than personal preference, and many believed that consuming fish during fasting periods was a way to show devotion, discipline, and obedience to the Church's teachings, reinforcing the notion that food was not simply about taste or comfort but also about spiritual duty, self-control, and the rejection of worldly pleasures in favor of moral purity and divine favor. During these times, meals became simpler and more structured, with fish replacing meat in most dishes, and there was little variation in how it was prepared or served, as the focus remained on following religious rules rather than experimenting with flavors or textures, and even when fish was available, it was often boiled in plain water or combined with minimal seasoning, making it one of the least flavorful components of the diet, though it was still considered a necessary part of life that helped maintain strength and energy during long periods of abstinence from other foods. Religious festivals and holy days also influenced the types of fish that were consumed, with certain species becoming associated with specific events or traditions, and some communities developed rituals around the preparation and sharing of fish meals, such as distributing portions to the poor, offering gifts to priests, or holding communal feasts in honor of saints or martyrs who were believed to have died for their faith. And although these events were not always extravagant, they reinforced the idea that food was a shared experience, a symbol of community, and a means of expressing gratitude, piety, or hope for the future. In monastic communities, where strict dietary rules were enforced by religious orders, fish was often the main source of animal protein, and monks maintained large fish ponds or rented space on nearby rivers to ensure a steady supply, and while they avoided indulgence in rich or spicy dishes, they did take care to prepare fish in ways that were both practical and respectful, sometimes using herbs, salt, or simple broths to enhance its natural flavor, though these additions were never excessive or seen as luxuries, and the overall approach to eating remained humble, disciplined, and focused on necessity rather than enjoyment. Even among the wealthy, who had access to a wider variety of foods, fish was not always considered a delicacy, and its use was often limited to specific times of the year or special occasions, with richer meats, cheeses, and wines being preferred for celebrations, banquets, and formal gatherings, and this distinction reflected broader societal values that associated meat with status, power, and abundance, while fish was seen as a more modest, accessible, and spiritually acceptable choice for those who wished to live humbly or follow religious guidelines. Despite these differences, the presence of fish in daily meals was a common thread across all levels of society, and it played a crucial role in maintaining the balance between sustenance, tradition, and religious practice, ensuring that even in times of scarcity or restriction, people could find nourishment in the simplest forms of food that required no elaborate preparation, no excess, and no waste, and that aligned with the values of endurance, simplicity, and quiet acceptance that defined the way people lived and ate in medieval Europe. Dairy products and their limited role in the daily lives of people living in Europe during the years between 1300 and 1400, dairy products such as cheese, milk, and butter played a role in diets, though they were not as consistently available or widely consumed as grains, vegetables, or fish, and their presence on the table depended largely on the type of community, the season of the year, and the availability of livestock that could be used for milking, grazing, or other agricultural purposes. And while some households had access to fresh milk or small quantities of cheese, others relied on stored or dried forms of dairy that could be preserved for longer periods, making them more practical in times of scarcity or when transporting goods was difficult due to poor roads, harsh weather, or limited resources. Cheese was one of the most common dairy products, and it was produced from the milk of cows, goats, or sheep, which were often kept in small numbers by families who needed their milk for drinking, cooking, or making soft cheeses that could be eaten soon after production, while harder varieties were aged for weeks or months using salt, brine, or simple drying methods that helped prevent spoilage and allowed for storage in cool, dry places such as cellars, under floorboards, or inside wooden chests lined with cloth or straw, though even these methods were not always effective, and many cheeses became moldy, rancid, or infested with insects if not carefully monitored and rotated regularly. Milk itself was less commonly consumed by adults than by children, especially in rural areas where cows or goats were raised for both milk and meat, and while some families drank fresh milk directly from the animal, it was usually boiled before being used in recipes or given to young children who could not yet tolerate raw liquid without risk of illness, and because milk spoiled quickly without refrigeration, it was often used to make simple foods like soups, porridges, or thin breads that could be eaten immediately or stored for short periods, though these preparations were rarely elaborate or varied, and they tended to be bland, watery, or unappetizing unless combined with other ingredients such as herbs, grains, or scraps of fat to add texture and flavor. Butter was even rarer than cheese or milk, and it was typically reserved for special occasions, medicinal uses, or the households of wealthier individuals who had access to large quantities of cream from well-fed cows. And while some villages or monasteries may have produced small amounts of butter for local consumption, it was generally considered a luxury item that required careful handling and storage in cool, dark places to prevent melting or rancidity, and even then, it was often used sparingly, either spread thinly on bread, mixed into porridge, or added to stews in small amounts to enhance richness and moisture, though the overall effect was minimal compared to the heavy use of fats like lard or tallow, which were more readily available and easier to produce in large quantities. The production of dairy products was labor-intensive and time-consuming, requiring constant care of animals, regular milking, and careful preparation of tools and containers to avoid contamination, and since there were no modern pasteurization techniques or sterilization methods, milk and cheese were often associated with health risks, leading many people to avoid consuming them unless absolutely necessary, especially during times of illness, poor weather, or high humidity that increased the likelihood of spoilage and bacterial growth, and in some cases, people believed that certain types of dairy could cause digestive discomfort, fever, or imbalance in the body's humors, reinforcing the idea that food should be chosen carefully and consumed in moderation rather than indulged in for pleasure or variety. In addition to the challenges of preserving dairy, there were also social and economic factors that influenced its availability, with wealthier households having greater access to fresh milk, cheese, and butter due to their ability to maintain larger herds, invest in better storage facilities, and hire additional help for daily tasks like feeding, cleaning, and milking, while poorer families often had to rely on what little they could gather from nearby farms, trade with neighbors, or receive as part of religious or communal distributions, and even then, the quantities were limited and subject to seasonal changes that made it difficult to plan meals around dairy-based dishes. Religious beliefs also played a role in how dairy was consumed, as the Christian Church sometimes restricted the use of milk and cheese during fasting periods, especially in the same way that meat and eggs were banned, and while this rule was not always strictly enforced, it reinforced the idea that dairy was a secondary food source that should be used sparingly and only when necessary, rather than as a regular part of the diet, and this attitude extended to monastic communities, where strict dietary regulations governed what could be eaten and when, and even monks who lived in isolated abbeys often avoided excessive consumption of dairy to maintain discipline, humility, and a focus on spiritual rather than physical nourishment. Despite these limitations, dairy products were still valued for their ability to provide essential nutrients, especially for children, the elderly, and those recovering from illness, and they were often used in combination with other foods to create simple, nourishing meals that could sustain people through long days of work, prayer, or rest. And although the taste and texture of dairy-based dishes were not always appealing, they were accepted as part of the natural order of life, where every meal served a purpose, and every ingredient contributed to the survival of the household in a world where abundance was rare and waste was discouraged at all costs. Over time, small variations in dairy consumption emerged based on region, climate, and cultural practices, with some areas favoring certain types of cheese, milk, or butter over others depending on local traditions, available resources, or historical influences, but these differences were subtle and did not significantly alter the overall pattern of eating, which remained focused on simplicity, repetition, and the acceptance of limitation rather than the pursuit of comfort or satisfaction, and this quiet endurance defined the way people experienced food in medieval Europe, where the value of a meal was measured not by its taste or complexity, but by its ability to keep the body strong, the mind clear, and the soul in balance with the rhythms of nature, faith, and duty. Drinks people consumed with their meals in the daily lives of people living in Europe during the years between 1300 and 1400. Drinking was a necessary part of eating, and water, beer, ale, wine, and occasionally other beverages were consumed regularly as companions to meals, though the types and quantities of drinks varied depending on location, season, social status, and availability, and while some people drank only water or diluted wine, others had access to stronger or more frequent sources of liquid that could be used for hydration, warmth, or even medicinal purposes, and despite the lack of modern sanitation or filtration methods, most people relied on what was available at the time, believing that drinking from rivers, wells, or communal vessels was a natural and safe practice, even if it sometimes led to illness or discomfort due to contamination. Water was the most common drink, especially in rural areas where wells, streams, and rainwater collection systems provided a steady supply, and it was often used to cook food, wash dishes, or dilute stronger liquids like beer or wine, but it was also consumed directly when needed, especially during hot weather or after long hours of physical labor. And although many believed that water should be boiled or filtered to avoid sickness, This practice was not always possible, and people often drank from the same source used by animals, which increased the risk of disease and made clean water a rare and valuable commodity in some regions. Beer and ale were among the most widely consumed drinks, especially in towns and villages where brewing was a common household or small-scale industry, and they were made from barley, wheat, or rye using simple fermentation techniques that required minimal equipment and could be done year-round, with families producing small batches at home or purchasing larger quantities from local brewers who sold their products in wooden casks, clay jugs, or earthenware pots that were passed around during meals, shared among workers, or stored for later use. And because beer contained alcohol, it was considered safer than water in many cases, as the fermentation process killed harmful bacteria and made it less likely to cause illness, though it still carried risks, especially when brewed in unsanitary conditions or left to sit too long without proper storage. Wine was less common and more expensive, and it was primarily consumed by wealthier households, religious institutions, or those who lived near vineyards or trade routes that brought it from distant lands, and it was often diluted with water to reduce its strength and make it more palatable, especially for children, the elderly, or those who were not accustomed to drinking it regularly. And although it was seen as a luxury item, it was also used in religious ceremonies, medical treatments, and social gatherings, reinforcing the idea that certain drinks were associated with status, piety, or celebration rather than everyday consumption. In addition to these beverages, some people drank herbal infusions, fruit juices, or fermented milk-based drinks like sour milk or kefir, which were believed to have health benefits or provide relief from digestive issues, and these were often prepared at home using ingredients that could be gathered from nearby fields, gardens, or markets, though they were not always available in large quantities and were often consumed only when other options were limited or when specific needs arose, such as treating a cold, easing stomach pain, or providing nourishment to sick or weak individuals. The preparation of drinks was usually simple and repetitive, involving boiling grains, soaking fruits, fermenting liquids, or mixing ingredients together in open containers that allowed air to circulate and promote the growth of yeast. And since there were no precise measurements, timers, or temperature controls, the results varied widely depending on the skill of the person making the drink, the quality of the ingredients, and the environmental conditions, leading to inconsistencies in taste, strength, and safety that were accepted as part of life rather than avoided or corrected through innovation or experimentation. Drinking was often a communal activity, with people sharing cups, bowls, or bottles during meals, and while this practice helped conserve resources and build social bonds, it also increased the risk of spreading illness, especially in crowded homes or public spaces where hygiene standards were low. And despite this, people continued to drink from the same vessel repeatedly, believing that it was a natural and acceptable way to share food and drink with others, especially within families or close-knit communities where trust and familiarity were strong. The act of drinking was not typically associated with pleasure, excitement, or indulgence, but rather with necessity, tradition, and the need to stay hydrated, warm, or energized throughout the day, and there was little emphasis placed on the taste, aroma, or variety of drinks, as long as they filled the stomach, warmed the body, and did not cause immediate harm. And this practical approach extended to all forms of liquid consumption, whether it was water, beer, wine, or something else, with no expectation of novelty, comfort, or enjoyment beyond basic survival. Religious beliefs also influenced how people drank, as the Christian Church sometimes encouraged moderation, self-discipline, and abstinence from excessive drinking, especially during fasting periods or when preparing for holy days. And while this rule was not always strictly followed, it reinforced the idea that drinking should be done responsibly and in accordance with spiritual values, rather than for entertainment, excess, or personal gratification, and this attitude was particularly strong among monastic communities, where strict dietary and behavioral codes governed every aspect of life, including the consumption of liquids, and where even wine was treated as a sacred offering rather than a casual beverage. Over time, small changes occurred in the types of drinks available and the ways they were consumed, as new ingredients, techniques, or cultural influences spread through trade, travel, or migration. But these changes were slow and often adapted to fit existing customs rather than replacing them entirely, so the overall pattern of drinking remained largely unchanged, with most people continuing to rely on the same basic beverages that had been used for generations, and no one expected anything different, because the rhythm of life was shaped by routine, necessity, and the acceptance of limitation rather than the pursuit of comfort, novelty, or indulgence. And this quiet endurance defined the way people experienced food and drink in medieval Europe, where the value of a meal or a drink was measured not by its taste or complexity, but by its ability to keep the body strong, the mind clear, and the soul in balance with the rhythms of nature, faith, and duty. Spices, sweeteners, and rare ingredients in the daily lives of people living in Europe during the years between 1300 and 1400. Spices such as pepper, cinnamon, saffron, and cloves were not commonly used in everyday cooking, and they were considered rare, expensive, and mostly available to wealthier households or religious institutions that had access to trade networks bringing them from distant lands. And while some people may have encountered these ingredients through merchants, travelers, or religious figures who brought them from the East, they were rarely incorporated into regular meals due to their high cost, limited availability, and the lack of knowledge about how to use them effectively in local cuisine. And even when they were used, it was usually in small quantities and only for special occasions or medicinal purposes rather than as a means of enhancing flavor or adding variety to daily food. Pepper, one of the most sought-after spices, was particularly prized for its ability to add heat and depth to dishes, but it was so costly that it was often reserved for the wealthy, who used it to season meats, stews, and sauces in ways that made their meals stand out from those of ordinary people. And while some lower-class individuals might have been given a tiny amount of pepper as part of a gift or trade, it was never used in large quantities or on a regular basis, and its presence in a meal was more of a status symbol than a practical addition to flavor. Cinnamon, another highly valued spice, was believed to have medicinal properties and was sometimes added to drinks, porridges, or breads to improve digestion or provide warmth, but it was also seen as a luxury item that could be used sparingly to make a meal feel more refined or sophisticated. And this perception reinforced the idea that spices were not meant for common consumption but rather for those who could afford to indulge in them without concern for cost or scarcity. Saffron, known for its vibrant color and strong aroma, was even rarer than pepper or cinnamon, and it was primarily used in religious or ceremonial contexts, where it was believed to have symbolic significance or spiritual value. And although it was occasionally added to soups or stews to give them a golden hue, it was never used in large amounts or with any regularity, as its price was so high that it was considered a treasure rather than a simple ingredient. Cloves, though less commonly used than the others, were similarly expensive and difficult to obtain, and they were often associated with health benefits, especially for treating toothaches or digestive issues, which led to their occasional use in remedies or herbal preparations rather than in everyday cooking, and this further emphasized the idea that spices were not just for flavor but also for their perceived healing properties, reinforcing the belief that certain ingredients had powers beyond their taste or texture. In addition to spices, sweeteners such as honey, dried fruits, and sugar were also relatively uncommon in most diets, and while honey was more accessible than sugar, it was still considered a valuable commodity that was used sparingly, often reserved for special occasions, medicinal uses, or the preparation of desserts that were not commonly eaten by the general population, and even then, the amount used was minimal, as excess sweetness was not seen as desirable or necessary, and there was little emphasis on creating rich or indulgent flavors in everyday meals, which were typically focused on filling the stomach, providing energy, and maintaining health rather than satisfying cravings or offering pleasure. Dried fruits like figs, dates, and raisins were occasionally used to add a touch of sweetness to porridges, breads, or stews, especially during times of scarcity or when fresh fruit was unavailable, and they were often stored in small quantities and used sparingly to avoid spoilage, but their role in daily meals was limited, and they were not seen as essential components of the diet, but rather as occasional additions that could enhance the texture or complexity of a dish without changing its overall character. Sugar, on the other hand, was extremely rare and almost exclusively used by the wealthy, who imported it from the Middle East or the Mediterranean regions where it was produced in small quantities, and even then, it was often mixed with other ingredients like wine, honey, or spices to create elaborate pastries or sweetened drinks that were consumed only by those who could afford them, and for most people, the idea of eating something purely for its sweetness was foreign, as the primary goal of food was to provide sustenance, not to satisfy desires or create pleasure, and this mindset extended to all aspects of diet, where simplicity, necessity, and tradition took precedence over experimentation, indulgence, or novelty. The use of rare ingredients was also influenced by religious beliefs, as the Christian Church sometimes discouraged the excessive use of spices or sweeteners, viewing them as signs of greed, luxury, or moral weakness, and while this rule was not always strictly enforced, it reinforced the idea that food should be plain, humble, and unadorned, reflecting the values of piety, discipline, and self-control that were central to many people's way of life, and this attitude was particularly strong among monastic communities, where strict dietary regulations governed what could be eaten and how it should be prepared, and where even the smallest amount of spice or sugar was treated with caution and restraint. Over time, small changes occurred in the types of ingredients available and the ways they were used. As trade routes expanded, new goods entered Europe, and cultural influences spread through contact with other regions. But these changes were gradual and often adapted to fit existing customs rather than replacing them entirely, so the overall pattern of using rare ingredients remained largely unchanged, with most people continuing to rely on the same basic foods that had been used for generations, and no one expected anything different, because the rhythm of life was shaped by routine, necessity, and the acceptance of limitation rather than the pursuit of comfort, novelty, or indulgence, and this quiet endurance defined the way people experienced food in medieval Europe, where the value of a meal or an ingredient was measured not by its richness or complexity, but by its ability to keep the body strong, the mind clear, and the soul in balance with the rhythms of nature. Faith and duty. Cooking methods and kitchen routines across regions in the daily lives of people living in Europe during the years between 1300 and 1400. Cooking methods varied depending on location, available resources, and the size of the household, but they were generally simple, repetitive, and focused on practicality rather than complexity or creativity. And while some regions had access to more advanced tools or techniques, most people relied on basic methods that required minimal equipment, fuel, and time, and these methods were passed down through generations as part of a shared cultural heritage that emphasized survival, tradition, and the acceptance of limitation rather than the pursuit of comfort or novelty. Boiling was the most common cooking method, as it required only a pot, a fire, and water, and it allowed for the preparation of soups, stews, porridges, and other dishes that could be made with whatever ingredients were available at the time, and since boiling was relatively safe, efficient, and easy to manage, it was used for nearly every meal, regardless of whether the food was meat, vegetables, grains, or fish, and this consistency helped maintain a sense of order and predictability in daily life, where meals followed a familiar pattern and rarely deviated from what had been done before. Roasting was another method used, especially in larger households or communal settings such as monasteries, castles, or market towns, where fires were kept burning for long periods and large pieces of meat could be cooked over open flames using spits, hooks, or metal rods that turned slowly to ensure even cooking. And although this technique required more fuel and attention than boiling, it was often used for special occasions, religious festivals, or when there was enough food to justify the effort, and the resulting dishes were usually served in large portions to groups of people who gathered around the fire to eat together, reinforcing the idea that food was not just about nourishment but also about community, sharing, and social interaction. Baking was less common in everyday cooking, especially in rural areas where ovens were rare or difficult to maintain, and it was typically reserved for bread, pastries, or specific dishes that required heat to be evenly distributed over a long period. And while some families had access to small clay or stone ovens, many relied on communal baking facilities located in villages, churches, or marketplaces, where residents brought their dough on designated days and waited for it to be baked in. Shared ovens that were heated by wood fires and maintained by experienced bakers who adjusted temperatures based on experience rather than precise measurements, and this system ensured that everyone had access to fresh bread, though it also meant that meals were prepared on a schedule rather than on demand, and no one expected immediate results or personal convenience. The use of firewood was a constant concern, as it was needed for cooking, heating, and lighting, and it had to be collected manually from nearby forests, fields, or markets, where it was sold in bundles or sacks. And since fuel was expensive and limited, people often conserved it by preparing large batches of food at once and reusing leftovers over several days, which meant that many meals were reheated, simmered, or eaten cold, and this practice contributed to a slow, deliberate pace of eating that was closely tied to the rhythms of daily life, where work, rest, and meals followed predictable patterns without much variation or spontaneity. Cooking tools were simple and often made from materials that were readily available, such as wooden spoons, iron pots, clay bowls, and stone grinding stones. And while some households had access to knives, forks, or ladles, these items were usually shared among family members or used for multiple purposes, and there was little emphasis on individual utensils or specialized equipment, as the goal was to complete the task efficiently rather than to make the process more comfortable or convenient. And this approach reflected a broader cultural mindset that valued simplicity, endurance, and the ability to adapt to hardship rather than to seek out luxury or ease. Cleaning and maintenance of kitchen spaces were also minimal, with no modern conveniences like dishwashers, sinks, or soap, and most people relied on natural water sources such as rivers, wells, or rainwater to wash their hands, bowls, and cooking vessels, and after meals, they wiped their hands on cloths, grass, or their own clothing, and swept crumbs off the floor with brooms made from bundled twigs tied to sticks. And while this level of cleanliness may seem low by modern standards, it was considered sufficient for the time, as there was little understanding of germs or hygiene beyond basic practices like keeping fires lit to prevent smoke buildup and avoiding eating directly from the ground, which was seen as unclean and potentially dangerous. Meals were often eaten in shared spaces, with no separate dining rooms or private tables, and people sat on wooden benches, stools, or the floor, passing bowls and cups from one person to another without concern for individual portions or hygiene. And since there were no proper chairs, tables, or plates, food was placed on thick slices of stale bread called trenchers, which absorbed juices and were later given to animals or the poor after the meal ended. And this practice saved time and effort in cleaning while also reducing waste, as nothing went unused and even the remnants of meals served a purpose in feeding livestock or supporting the needy, which aligned with religious teachings about charity and humility. The act of cooking itself was repetitive and time-consuming, involving hours of kneading dough, watching pots, cleaning tools, and managing fires, and women and children bore most of this responsibility, passing down knowledge about consistency, rising times, oven heat, and storage methods through observation and practice rather than written instruction, since literacy was rare and cookbooks did not exist for common households. And over time, small changes occurred in how food was prepared and consumed, as new techniques, tools, or influences entered local communities. But these shifts happened so slowly that individuals might live their entire lives without noticing any meaningful difference in the way they cooked or ate, and this quiet continuity provided a sense of stability in a world where change was often dangerous, unwelcome, and best avoided whenever possible. For most people, the experience of cooking was unremarkable and forgettable, blending into the background of daily life like breathing or walking, and no one remembered exactly what they had cooked yesterday or expected anything different tomorrow, because the rhythm of meals was governed by necessity, tradition, and the slow turning of the seasons rather than choice, desire, or innovation. And this quiet endurance defined the way people lived and ate in medieval Europe, where satisfaction came not from richness or variety but from continuity, repetition, and the simple act of surviving another day without hunger. Seasonal changes and the slow evolution of taste preferences in the daily lives of people living in Europe during the years between 1300 and 1400, the experience of eating was closely tied to the changing seasons, and the availability of food fluctuated with the weather, the growth of crops, and the movement of animals, and while this pattern was consistent across most regions, it shaped the way people approached meals, prepared food, and thought about taste, with each season bringing its own set of challenges, opportunities, and routines that influenced what was eaten and how it was consumed. And although there was little variation in the basic ingredients used or the methods of preparation, the rhythm of life was dictated by the natural cycle of planting, harvesting, storing, and consuming, which created a sense of continuity and predictability that defined the way people lived and ate. Spring brought the first signs of renewal, with fresh greens, herbs, and young plants becoming available after the long winter months when food had been limited to dried grains, preserved meats, and stored vegetables. And as the days grew longer and the temperature warmed, people began to look forward to the return of fresh produce that could be gathered from fields, forests, and gardens. And although these early spring foods were often small, bitter, or difficult to prepare, they were welcomed as a welcome change from the monotonous diet of the previous months, reinforcing the idea that variety, even if minimal, was a sign of hope, abundance, and the promise of better times ahead. Summer offered more options, with fruits, berries, and vegetables reaching their peak, and for the first time in months, people could enjoy the sweetness of apples, pears, plums, and cherries, as well as the crispness of lettuce, cucumbers, and radishes. And while these items were not always abundant or easy to store, they provided a refreshing contrast to the heavier, more filling meals of earlier seasons. And this shift in diet helped maintain energy levels, improve digestion, and offer a brief respite from the repetitive nature of daily meals, though even these changes were subtle and did not significantly alter the overall structure of eating habits, which remained focused on necessity, tradition, and the acceptance of limitation rather than the pursuit of comfort or novelty. Autumn was a time of preparation, as families gathered and stored the last harvests before the cold weather set in, and the focus shifted from enjoying fresh food to ensuring that enough supplies were available to last through the winter months, and this meant that many meals became simpler, less varied, and more reliant on dried legumes, preserved meats, and root vegetables that could be kept for long periods without spoiling. And although this period of scarcity was often difficult, it was also seen as a natural part of life, where survival depended on careful planning, resourcefulness, and the ability to adapt to changing conditions. And this mindset reinforced the idea that food was not just about taste or enjoyment but about endurance, responsibility, and the quiet acceptance of hardship. Winter, however, was the most challenging season, when the availability of fresh food dropped dramatically, and people relied heavily on stored supplies, occasional hunting, and charity from wealthier neighbors or church-supported kitchens to survive until the next growing season. And during these months, meals became even more repetitive, consisting of the same porridge, bread, and soup day after day with only slight variations based on what remained in storage, and this monotony was accepted as normal, unchangeable, and part of the natural order of life, where the focus was on surviving rather than indulging, and the idea of flavor was not linked to richness, complexity, or excitement but to familiarity, warmth, and fullness, and a piece of slightly stale bread dipped in thin soup was considered satisfying not because it tasted good in any exciting way but because it filled the stomach, required no chewing effort if softened first, and reminded the eater of countless other meals, just like it, that had sustained them through childhood, adulthood, and old age in a cycle of quiet repetition that defined the rhythm of life in medieval Europe. Despite the challenges of seasonal changes, the overall pattern of eating remained remarkably consistent, with few significant shifts in taste preferences, cooking methods, or dietary habits over the course of the century, and this stability reflected broader cultural values that emphasized tradition, simplicity, and the acceptance of limitation rather than the pursuit of comfort, novelty, or indulgence. And this quiet endurance defined the way people experienced food in medieval Europe, where the value of a meal was measured not by its taste or complexity, but by its ability to keep the body strong, the mind clear, and the soul in balance with the rhythms of nature, faith, and duty. And even as the world around them changed slowly over time, the way people ate remained rooted in routine, necessity, and the unspoken understanding that survival was more important than satisfaction, and that the act of eating was not about pleasure or excitement, but about sustenance, endurance, and the simple, quiet continuation of life, one meal at a time.